The doors were supposed to open at exactly 4 o'clock. Nora Callahan stood behind them in a dress her mother never lived to see her wear, gripping a bouquet so tightly the stems left red lines across her palms. She listened for footsteps. Any footsteps. The ones that were supposed to belong to the man waiting for her at the altar. 4 o'clock came, then 10 minutes passed, then 20. Somewhere beyond those doors, 200 guests were shifting in their seats, and somewhere beyond that, Caleb Whitfield, the man she was supposed to marry in exactly 4 minutes, had vanished without a word. Her phone buzzed once inside her mother's old handbag. She nearly dropped the bouquet reaching for it, certain it would be him, certain there'd be some simple explanation. A flat tire, a lost tie, anything at all. It wasn't him. It was a number she didn't recognize, and a message that would rewrite the rest of her life. He's not coming, Nora, and you deserve to know why. Word travels fast in a room full of people dressed for a celebration that isn't happening anymore. Within minutes, the officiant was clearing his throat into a microphone that suddenly felt too loud, announcing a short delay. Within 10 more, the delay had a different name: humiliation. Aunt Ruth found her first, in the little side room with the peeling gold wallpaper, the bouquet already wilting in Nora's shaking hands. "Baby, look at me," Ruth said, gripping her shoulders. "Whatever this is, we will survive it. We always have." Nora didn't answer. She was staring past her aunt, through the crack in the door, at the back row of the chapel. There was a man there she had never seen before in her life. Tall, a dark coat that looked like it cost more than her shop's rent for a year. He wasn't checking his phone like everyone else, wasn't whispering to the person beside him, because there was no one beside him. He was watching her, and not with the pity written across every other face in that room. He was watching her, like he already knew exactly how this story ended. The moment the officiant said the word, "postponed," the stranger stood and slipped out the side door without a sound. Nobody else seemed to notice him at all. Nora did, and underneath the humiliation crawling up her throat, a new question took root, sharp enough to cut through everything else. Who was he, and how long had he known this was coming? By the time the sun went down, Caleb's car was found exactly where he'd parked it that morning, in the gravel lot behind the chapel. His phone sat on the passenger seat, screen shattered, like it had been thrown rather than dropped. No Caleb, no note, no answer from a single soul who claimed to know him. The sheriff called it cold feet. Nora wanted, badly, to believe that. Cold feet she could survive. Cold feet meant heartbreak, not danger. But cold feet didn't usually come with a stranger's foreknowledge, or a phone smashed hard enough to crack the seat beneath it. She had learned young that the people you loved most could disappear without warning. She was 5 years old when a state trooper knocked on her aunt's door to explain that her parents weren't coming home from a rainy drive they had taken one Tuesday night. Ruth raised her since, in the apartment above what would eventually become Nora's flower shop, the two of them building a life out of second-hand furniture, Sunday pancakes, and a fierce, quiet love that never once felt like settling. Nora had built her whole adult life around one stubborn belief: if she loved hard enough and worked honest enough, nothing would ever be ripped away from her again. Caleb's disappearing act had just cracked that belief straight down the middle. And the stranger from the back row wasn't finished with her yet. 3 days after the wedding, that wasn't. A black car pulled up outside Nora's flower shop, just as she was flipping the sign to closed. She recognized him instantly. The coat, the posture, the way he seemed to take up more space than his body actually occupied. Up close, he looked younger than she expected, mid-30s maybe, with the kind of tired eyes that belonged to a man who hadn't slept right in years. "Miss Callahan." His voice was quieter than she expected too. "My name is Julian Sinclair. I think you have questions. I think I owe you some answers. She didn't move from the doorway. You were at my wedding. I was. Nobody invited you. No, he agreed. Nobody did. Her hand tightened on the frame. Did you do something to Caleb? Something flickered across his face. Not guilt, exactly. Something close to it. I never touched him, he said carefully. But I know why he ran, and I don't think you're going to like it. She let him in only because the alternative, standing on the sidewalk while half the town watched a stranger's car idle outside her shop, was somehow worse. He told her, gently but without softening a single fact, that Caleb had been drowning in gambling debt for over a year, that the men he owed didn't send polite reminders, that 3 days before the wedding, they had made it very clear what would happen, and to whom, if he didn't pay. He was scared, Julian said, not of marrying you, of what marrying you might cost you. Nora sat very still, feeling something shift low in her chest. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Just the terrifying possibility that the man who left her at the altar had been trying, badly and clumsily, to protect her instead of betray her. How do you know all of this? She asked. Why would any of it matter to a man like you? Julian was quiet, a moment too long. Let's just say, he finally said, your family and mine have history you don't know about yet. What history? I've never met you in my life. Not yet you haven't, he said. And something about the way he said it made the back of her neck go cold. Not the way that counts. She wanted to press harder, but he was already standing, already sliding an envelope across the counter. Bank statements, a name, plain proof of the debt he'd described. He was halfway to the door when his eyes caught on the small framed photograph she kept by the register. Her parents, young and laughing, on a porch that didn't exist anymore. He looked at it, 2 full seconds too long. Wait, Nora said. You know something about them too, don't you? For just a moment, his composure cracked all the way down to something almost pleading. Not tonight, he said. You've had enough taken from you this week. I won't take this too. Not until you're ready to hear it. He left before she could argue. She stood alone in her darkened shop for a long time afterward, staring at her parents' photograph like it might finally answer the question he wouldn't. She had no idea that answer was still weeks away, or that when it finally came, it would cost her far more than any wedding ever could. The envelope didn't erase the humiliation. If anything, it complicated it, because now the whole town wasn't only whispering about a runaway groom, they were whispering about the reclusive billionaire from the estate on Miller's Ridge showing up at her shop 3 days later. Nora barely had time to process any of it before her own body delivered a headline far bigger than either one. 2 weeks after the wedding, that never happened, sitting on the edge of a bathtub with a plastic stick, trembling in her hand, Nora Callahan learned she was carrying a child whose father had vanished off the face of the earth. She didn't cry right away. She just sat there, running the math backward, forward, sideways, searching for a version of this that made sense. There wasn't one. When she finally told Ruth, her aunt didn't gasp, didn't panic, didn't say a single one of the things Nora had braced herself to hear. She pulled her into a hug tight enough to hurt and said, "Well, looks like this family's about to get one person bigger. Ruth, I can't do this alone." "You won't," Ruth said fiercely. "You have never once been alone in your life, and you are not starting now." But alone was exactly how it felt some nights, lying awake doing math on a flower shop income that barely covered rent, wondering how she would explain any of this to a child one day, wondering if her own father, wherever he was, had felt this same drowning fear before the crash that took him. 3 days later, a small package arrived at the shop with no return address. Inside was a prenatal vitamin subscription, already paid a full year in advance, and a note with only 4 words. "You are not alone." Nora stared at it for a long time. Nobody outside her aunt's kitchen knew she was pregnant yet. So how did he? She confronted him about it the following week, marching into the marble lobby of Sinclair Industries, still wearing her work apron because she hadn't had time to change, demanding to know how a stranger she'd met exactly once knew about a pregnancy she hadn't told anyone outside her own kitchen. Julian didn't lie to her. He never really tried to. "I have people who keep an eye on the town," he admitted, leading her up to an office with a view that made her stomach drop, for reasons that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. "Not spying, watching, making sure you were safe. I've done it for years, Nora. Long before Caleb. Long before any of this." "Years?" Her voice cracked on the word. "Why? Why me, out of every person in that town?" He was quiet a long moment, staring out at the city lights instead of at her, like it was easier to tell the truth to glass than to a face. "My mother died when I was 9, he said finally. "My father never remarried. He built an empire instead, and somewhere in there, he forgot how to look at me like I was anything other than the next name on a letterhead. The day he died, he grabbed my hand and made me promise him one thing. Not to protect the company, not the family name, to protect you." "Me?" She repeated the word, like it belonged to a language she didn't speak. "Why would your father care what happened to me?" "Because," Julian said, and something in his voice broke slightly, "I think he spent the last 20 years of his life trying to make up for something he never had the courage to say out loud. And I think if I tell you what that something is, it's going to hurt you in ways I'm not ready to be responsible for. Not yet." It wasn't an answer. It was the opposite of an answer. And yet somehow it was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in weeks. "You've spent your whole life being someone's obligation too, haven't you?" she said quietly. Not a question, a recognition. Julian looked at her like no one had ever said that sentence to him before in his life. "Every single day," he said, "until about 3 weeks ago." Neither of them moved. Neither of them said anything else for a long moment, and it was the kind of silence that says more than dialogue ever could. Two people who had both spent their lives being loved for what they represented, instead of who they actually were, sitting in the wreckage of everything they had lost, finding something unbearably human in each other for the very first time. "I'm scared," Nora admitted, so softly she barely heard herself say it. "Not of raising a child alone. I know how to be alone. I'm scared of wanting something I have no right to want right now." Julian didn't move closer. He didn't have to. "Then we'll be scared at the same time," he said. "That has to count for something. If this story is already sitting somewhere in your chest right now, that's not an accident. That's exactly what a real story is supposed to do. Go ahead and hit that like button and drop a comment telling me the exact moment it started getting to you. This one only gets heavier from here, and I'd love to know I'm not the only one feeling it." Nora went home that night and didn't sleep. Not because she was afraid anymore, because for the first time since the wedding, that never happened, she wasn't sure what scared her more, losing everything again, or letting herself hope that this time she wouldn't have to. Hope, it turned out, came with a price tag Nora hadn't budgeted for. Business at the shop had cratered. Nobody wants wedding arrangements from the woman whose own wedding became the town's favorite gossip, and morning sickness didn't care that rent was due on the 1st of the month regardless. Worse, one of Caleb's old creditors, a wiry man with a gold watch and a smile that never reached his eyes, showed up at her counter one afternoon, asking where his money was, since in his mind, marrying into misfortune had made her responsible for cleaning it up. She was still shaking behind the register 20 minutes later when Julian walked in, like he'd known. Maybe he had. "Marry me," he said, without any preamble at all. Nora actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark of a sound. "I'm sorry, what?" "Not for love," he said quickly. before she could throw him out. Not yet, anyway. For protection. My name ends conversations like the one you just had. It ends them permanently. You'd have security. For yourself and the baby. And time to figure out the rest, without a wolf circling your door every week. You want to marry a woman who's pregnant with another man's child. I want to make sure that child never grows up feeling like an obligation, Julian said, steady and unhurried. The way I did. It should have been an easy no. It was supposed to be an easy no. She had spent her whole adult life refusing to be anyone's charity case, refusing to let a man's money decide whether she survived. But she thought of Ruth's medical bills, stacking up in a kitchen drawer no one talked about. She thought of the creditor's smile. She thought of a version of her child's future that didn't involve either one. This isn't a fairy tale, she warned him. I'm not going to fall in love with you just because you wrote me a check. I'm not asking you to, Julian said. I'm asking you to let me keep the one promise I've never managed to break. She signed the contract 3 days later at his lawyer's office, hand trembling over the signature line. Fully aware, she had no idea whether she had just been rescued or recruited into someone else's much older story. The estate on Miller's Ridge looked like something out of a magazine she had once flipped through in a waiting room, never imagining she would someday sleep under its roof. Staff called her Mrs. Sinclair before she had even gotten used to hearing it out loud. A closet appeared, suddenly full of clothes in her exact size, though she never remembered being measured for any of it. She caught herself, more than once, wondering exactly how long Julian had been putting together a version of her life she hadn't chosen for herself yet. She also caught him, one evening, kneeling on the kitchen floor helping an elderly housekeeper named Della pick up a dropped tray of shattered dishes with his own hands, laughing at himself when he sliced his palm open on a piece of glass, waving off Della's fussing like it was nothing at all. Not the cold, calculating billionaire the tabloids like to paint. Just a tired man, still learning how to be gentle with people, instead of merely useful to them. She started, against every warning she had given herself, to like him. That terrified her more than the wedding disaster ever had. The spring gala for Sinclair Industries came 3 weeks into their arrangement, Nora's first real public appearance as Mrs. Sinclair, in a room full of chandeliers that cost more than her childhood home. It was there that a woman in emerald silk introduced herself with a smile sharp enough to draw blood. Vivian Marsh, she said, extending a hand weighted down with a ring Nora hadn't asked about. Julian and I go back. Family friends, practically arranged if we're being honest with each other. His grandmother still keeps my photograph on her mantle, bless her heart. How lovely, Nora said carefully. It is, isn't it? Vivian's smile didn't move an inch. Has he told you about the birthday clause yet? No? Interesting. She leaned in like they were old friends trading a secret. Julian has to be married by his 35th birthday, darling, or the whole company slips out of his hands and into his cousin Marcus's. 6 weeks from now, as it happens. Funny how convenient your timing was. She walked away before Nora could respond, leaving her standing in a room full of crystal and old money, with a single sentence quietly detonating in her chest. Convenient timing. Was that all she had ever been to him? A deadline with a heartbeat? She didn't sleep that night either. She lay in a bed too big for one person, running through every kind thing Julian had ever done for her, wondering for the first time whether kindness and convenience could look exactly the same from the inside looking out. The answer came from a place she never expected. Della found her the next afternoon in the estate's old library, dusting shelves that clearly hadn't been touched by anyone but her in years. And when Nora asked, mostly to make conversation, how long the Sinclair family had lived on the ridge, the old housekeeper's face did something complicated. Since before the accident, Della said, then caught herself, like she had said far more than she meant to. What accident? Della hesitated long enough that Nora thought she wouldn't answer at all, Then she crossed to a locked cabinet, produced a small brass key from her apron pocket, and pulled out a yellowed folder she clearly wasn't supposed to know still existed. Inside was a newspaper clipping, decades old, brittle at every fold. Structural engineer takes blame for Sinclair tower defect, license revoked. The photograph beneath the headline showed a young man Nora would have recognized anywhere, in any decade, under any circumstances on Earth. Her father, Thomas Callahan, had been the engineer of record on a Sinclair Industries building years before Nora was born, a building with a structural flaw that Edmund Sinclair's company had known about and buried, rather than pay to fix. When the flaw was finally discovered, someone had to take the blame to keep the Sinclair name out of the papers. Her father took it, lost his license, lost his career, lost, less than 2 years later, his life and his wife's. On a rain-soaked road they were driving home on the night they lost a final appeal that might have cleared his name. Nora sat on the library floor with the clipping shaking in her hands, feeling every kindness Julian had ever shown her rearrange itself into something else entirely. The scholarship that appeared out of nowhere the year she turned 18, the unexplained referrals that kept her tiny shop afloat through 3 lean winters, the prenatal vitamins, the proposal, even maybe the first conversation in her shop, and every gentle word since. None of it had ever really been about her. It had been about a debt his family owed hers, one Edmund Sinclair had spent the last years of his life trying to make right, in secret, through his son, because he never found the courage to look Thomas Callahan's daughter in the eye and simply say the 2 words he owed her most: "I'm sorry." She found Julian in his study an hour later, the clipping still shaking in her hand, and for the first time since the day they had met, he looked genuinely afraid of her. "Say it," she demanded, her voice shaking harder than the paper. "Tell me it isn't true." He didn't. He couldn't. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I swear to you, I was building up to it." "For how long? Weeks? Months? Was any part of this ever real, Julian? Or am I just your family's guilty conscience wearing a wedding ring?" The question hung in the air between them, and for the first time in this entire story, neither one of them had an answer ready. He never got the chance to find one before his phone lit up with the first of what would become 40 missed calls that night. By morning, the story was everywhere. A leaked internal memo revealed decades-old proof that Sinclair Industries had buried a known structural defect, alongside a suspiciously convenient sidebar naming Julian Sinclair's brand-new wife as the daughter of the very engineer they had once scapegoated to cover it up, splashed across headlines that read, "Marriage as cover-up." It hadn't come from Julian. It hadn't come from Nora. It had come from Marcus Sinclair, Julian's cousin, who had spent 3 years carefully building support on the board for exactly this moment. A scandal ugly enough to force an emergency vote, timed precisely 6 days before Julian's 35th birthday. The very deadline that would decide who controlled the company if Julian couldn't prove, publicly, that his marriage was real and his judgment still sound. Nora learned the rest of it that same week, delivered in the least likely way possible. Caleb Whitfield showed up at her shop's back door, gaunt, unshaven, looking like a man who had been running from more than just a wedding for a very long time. "I didn't leave because I stopped loving you," he said, before she could throw him back out into the street. "A man came to me 4 days before the wedding, said my debts would disappear if I did, said if I didn't, they wouldn't just come for me, they'd come for you too. I was a coward, Nora. I ran because I was scared, and I have hated myself every single day since." "Who paid you?" she asked, already knowing, already dreading the answer. "I don't know his name," Caleb admitted, "but he worked for a Sinclair, not Julian, the cousin." That same week, the stress of it all landed Nora in an emergency room at 2 in the morning, gripped by a fear sharper than any headline. Early contractions, Months too soon, a monitor beeping too fast, a doctor's carefully calm voice, using the words we need to watch this closely. Lying in that hospital bed, one hand on her stomach, and the other clutching Caleb's shaking confession, Nora understood with total clarity that she was no longer just fighting for her own broken heart. She was fighting for a family that hadn't even been born yet. The contractions eased by morning, the pregnancy held, and for the first time in months, Nora let herself breathe, without bracing for the next blow, right up until she remembered what still waited for her outside that hospital room. The board meeting was scheduled for the morning of Julian's birthday, in a glass-walled room 40 floors above the city, and Marcus Sinclair walked in, already smiling, like a man who had already won. He had not counted on Nora walking in beside her husband, 3 days out of the hospital, steady on her feet, through sheer force of will, holding a folder of her own. "Before anyone votes on anything," she said, and her voice did not shake, "I think you should all hear the truth, not the version leaked to the press. The real one." She told them about her father, not as a scandal, but as a man who had sacrificed everything to protect a company that never once thanked him for it. She told them about Edmund Sinclair's deathbed promise, and about a son who had spent years trying to keep that promise, instead of profiting from it. Then she placed Caleb's signed statement on the table, naming the man who had paid him to disappear. Marcus Sinclair didn't expose a scandal to protect this company, she said, looking directly at him now. He manufactured one, to protect his own claim to it. He paid a frightened, indebted man to abandon me at the altar, hoping I'd disappear quietly into my own heartbreak, instead of ever meeting the man sitting beside me. Instead, I found the truth, and I found his cousin, trying, badly, imperfectly, but honestly, to make things right. The silence in that room lasted a long time. It was broken, eventually, by the sound of half the board rising to defend the man they had almost voted out an hour earlier. Marcus didn't stay to hear the final tally. He was gone before security even reached the door, and within a month his name would be stripped, permanently, from every letterhead it had ever appeared on. Vivian Marsh sent exactly one text after that, a single word: "Congratulations." Neither Nora nor Julian ever heard from her again. Julian turned to Nora once the room had emptied, something raw and finally unguarded breaking free across his face. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You could have let me lose everything and walked away clean." "I didn't do it for the company," Nora said. "I didn't even do it for you, not really. I did it because I am done letting other people write the ending to my own story." "And what ending do you want?" She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had spent his whole life being useful instead of loved, standing in the wreckage of a scandal his own family had buried for 30 years, finally choosing honesty over legacy. "I want the one where nobody has to be anyone's guilty conscience," she said quietly. "I want the one where we just get to be two people who chose each other, debt-free." They married again 4 months later, quietly this time. No headlines, no cousins scheming in the wings, just Ruth crying happy tears in the front row, and Della sneaking sips of champagne in the kitchen doorway, because, she insisted, somebody had to keep an eye on the cake. Julian used part of that year's earnings to establish the Thomas Callahan Engineering Scholarship, not as an apology buried in fine print, but as a public plaque outside the very building his father's company had once tried to bury the truth about. He stood at the unveiling and said, in front of cameras he no longer flinched from, that the man deserved better than his family had ever given him, and that he intended to spend the rest of his life making sure the 30-year wait had been worth something. Their daughter arrived on a quiet Tuesday in October, healthy, loud, and utterly unbothered by the empire waiting just outside her nursery window. Julian held her before Nora even did. Tears ran freely down a face the business world had never once seen cry, and he whispered the only promise he ever intended to keep, without anyone forcing him to. "You are not anyone's debt," he told her, so softly only Nora heard it. "You are not anyone's obligation. You are simply, completely loved." Caleb sent a card that Christmas. No return address. Just 3 words. "I'm glad." Nora keeps it in a drawer she doesn't open often, but she has never once thrown it away. Because forgiveness, she has learned, doesn't always need to be spoken out loud to be real. Before we get to the very last page of this story, if it has meant anything to you, do one thing for me. Subscribe, so you never miss the next one. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that the truth always finds its way to the surface eventually. And tell me, in the comments, the biggest lesson you're walking away with. I read every single one, and it matters more than you probably know. Somewhere, on a quiet hill in Vermont, in a house that no longer needs anyone's permission to be happy, Nora Callahan learned the one lesson that no inheritance, no scandal, and no runaway groom could ever teach her faster than heartbreak did. The people who truly love you were never trying to rescue you from your life. They were only ever trying to earn the right to stand inside it, honestly, beside you, for good.